Welcome to the Adult Bible Study at First Baptist Church of Race City. My name is Charles. I'm one of our associate pastors, and today we're going to be diving back into the book of Job, chapter 19, verse 19 through 29. I hope you enjoy today's Bible study.
Job 19:19. All of my best friends despise me, and those I love have turned against me. What is Job saying by this statement? Simply put, everyone has left him. His close friends, his family, those that he loves. Job has become isolated from everyone and is alone in his suffering with no human companionship because everyone has turned against him. And not only has everybody turned against him, but Job speaking, my skin and my flesh cling to my bones, and I have escaped with only the skin of my teeth. What are these verses saying about Job's physical condition? Literally, he's barely hanging on to life. His skin and his flesh are barely clinging onto his bones. They're hanging off of him. And the phrase, by the skin of my teeth, comes from this section of Job, which literally says that he's barely alive. And who does Job believe put him in this position? In verse 6, Job points the finger at God, saying, God who has wronged me. Why would Job say this? As he has been arguing to his friends, he sees himself as innocent, deserving no wrong. Believing his own innocence leads him to grapple with innocent suffering. And in light of the suffering Job is enduring, this emotional suffering of the isolation from all friends and family, the physical suffering of his skin barely clinging onto his bones and having barely escaped by the skin of his teeth. In light of this suffering Job is enduring, he will plead with his friends who are heaping greater burden and suffering upon him to have mercy upon him, since he argues that he has been struck by God. Have mercy on me. My friends, have mercy, for God has struck me. Why do you persecute me as God does? Will you never get enough of my flesh? What is Job asking here but for his friends to stop persecuting him? And why? Because they're attacking him in their speech, accusing him of some wrong he has committed. And their attacks are like an animal after his flesh. And he seeks reprieve and mercy since he already finds himself as an enemy of God, because God is the one who has struck him. And God is the one who is also persecuting him. From Job's perspective, it is God who has struck him. Yet, as we see from Job 1:12 and 2:6, it is not God, but Satan. Since the Lord tells him in verse 1:12, he said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. God allows and gives permission to Satan to strike Job. He places it in Satan's hand. Again, in Job 2:6, and the Lord said to Satan, behold, he is in your hand. Only spare his life. It is not God, but Satan who has struck Job by the Lord's permission and with strict limitations. He can strike him, but spare his life. It is Satan who has put his hand against Job. Yet Job, from his perspective, not seeing that heavenly counsel between God and Satan, sees it as God. And this does not square with Job's understanding of God, as we will see in this next section. I wish that my words were written down, that they were recorded on a scroll, or were inscribed in stone forever by an iron stencil and lead. Why does Job wish his words were written down? Because Job believes in his innocence. He knows that he has done nothing that deserves this kind of judgment that he has received, the judgment that has caused him to be isolated, to barely be hanging on to life. And why does he want his words to be written down in this way? Well, Job wishes to be vindicated, and he does not see himself living much longer, as we have already seen by the fact that he is only hanging on by the skin of his teeth. So he wants the words of his innocence to be an enduring testimony, which is why he says that they need to be recorded in a scroll, but then he crescendos that to the next level. Not only recorded in a scroll or recorded in a book, as some translations put it, but inscribed in stone forever by an iron stencil and lead. The lead most likely is to be poured in to the engraving so that it might last and be an enduring legacy, an enduring testimony of Job's innocence. But Job understands that this would not even be the vindication that he needs. No, what he knows is that, but I know that my Redeemer lives. What is a redeemer? The Old Testament understanding was someone tied to you by covenant, usually a relative who would stand for you when you could not stand for yourself. So who or what does Job believe his Redeemer is? Job believes that his Redeemer, the one that lives, is God himself. Some scholars assert that Job's words, those which he is asking to be written down and inscribed so that they may be an enduring legacy, is the Redeemer that lives for Job. Yet this is highly suspect to me because only God can vindicate someone to God. And words do not have the power to stand on the dust of the earth, which is what that phrase, the dust, means. It can mean earth or it can mean the grave, which leads us to really ask an important question. If, as I've already asserted, that Job's Redeemer that lives is God himself, how can God, the living Redeemer, help Job against God whose hand has struck Job? And as I've already alluded, Job does not know of the heavenly court dialogue. So what he sees occurring in his life does not mesh with his understanding of the God he worships. He knows God to be righteous and just, yet the God who is against him seems to be the opposite. Since as Job said in verse 6 of chapter 19, it is God who has wronged me. And Job views himself as the enemy of God. Yet he also views himself as innocent before God, having done nothing worthy of judgment. Now, as I asserted in the last lesson, Job does not believe he is purely innocent, but yet knows that he is a worshiper of God and one who worships God and loves God. What he sees is that this doesn't square with the God who desires his glory to be made known and proclaimed and worshiped. Which leads us back to the question, how can this Redeemer God also help Job against the God who has struck him? And it goes back to the fact that it is not God who has struck him, but it was Satan. It is Satan who has stretched out his hand against Job. From Job's perspective, it all looks like God is the one who has done everything. And it is God who has allowed and given permission so that Job might be tested and shown to be the faithful servant that he is. But it is Satan who has ultimately struck Job by stretching out his hand against him. And so when Job says that I know my Redeemer lives, what he knows is that God is righteous and just, and that ultimately the living God will stand on the dust of his grave on the earth, calling out Job's vindication for his innocence, being one who is faithful and trusting in God. That even after his skin has been destroyed and he is in the grave, this righteous Redeemer who lives will proclaim Job's innocence before God. So how will Job see God in flesh? I will see him myself and my eyes will look upon him. Job is saying this to be done in the physical sense. How will Job see God face to face after he is dead and his skin is destroyed? The only way to stand before God is to be right before God, have been redeemed before the righteous God. And the only way to do it face to face with his eyes in his flesh would be to be resurrected and in a right standing with God. This is Job's greatest longing, the deepest longing of his heart, that he might stand in a right relationship before the God who he worships and loves with all of his heart. And you would think that that is where this section would stop. But instead, Job turns back to his friends and says, if you say, how will we pursue him? Who is pursuing who? Well, it is Job's friends who are pursuing or persecuting Job, since the root of the problem lies with him. That's one of the main ways that we know that it is Job's friends who are pursuing Job, because they have constantly, over the last 17 chapters, been telling Job that he is the root of the problem, and that the root of the problem lies with him, because he has done something to deserve this judgment. And he turns this on them and he says, then be afraid of the sword, because wrath brings punishment by the sword, so that you may know there is a judgment. Ultimately, you are judged by your deeds. However, Job's final words are a warning to his friends who have no system for understanding undeserved suffering, and therefore have no system for understanding undeserved grace. So they do not throw themselves upon the mercy of God, knowing that the only vindication that they have, the only way that they will ultimately be vindicated, is that their Redeemer lives. They don't throw themselves on that mercy. They're throwing themselves on their own ability to work, which will ultimately lead to judgment and wrath, because they cannot save themselves. Job is such a beautiful picture, because each of us suffer or care for someone who is suffering and who is asking the question, or we ask the question ourselves, why has this happened? Even sometimes going so far as to ask, is God against me? What we must realize is there is real spiritual evil in this world that is trying to tear us down and destroy us. So we must throw ourselves upon the mercy and grace of Jesus, who will judge the world, knowing that without him, we would have no hope. We know that each person who trusts in him is a sinner saved by undeserved grace. So let us trust God. Trust the fact that our Redeemer lives, and that he will stand on the dust of our graves and be the mediator that we need, so that we might be right with God and receive grace that we do not deserve from a Savior that we do not deserve.
Welcome to the question and answer time. My name is Summer. I'm Pastor Charles's wife. We're glad you're here with us. We're glad you're in the book of Job and you're studying it. We were talking earlier today. Job is such a good book. I would rank it as one of my top favorites. I feel like it's just so practical to meet people where they're at. I appreciated about this study that Job was real. Like, I think you saw his realness in this chapter, that he's wrestling through the goodness of God and his suffering, which I think that we all need to do. We even need to do that before suffering comes. And I just thought today maybe we can end this time with just, if you have an encouragement to those who are suffering. We don't know exactly who will watch this and what they're going through, but if you just have kind of a nugget of encouragement to give to those watching.
Something that I did not mention in the study is how Job is a picture of Christ as well, in that Christ suffered for us. Unlike Job, who suffered on his own, Jesus suffered in isolation, but he also suffered for us in general. And Job's suffering is a picture. And so I think basically the point that I'm trying to make is that as people, when we do suffer, we need and even must look to the cross.
Mm-hmm.
Look to the cross at how Jesus suffered. Look to the cross to see that we have a high priest, as Hebrews would say, that can sympathize with us, that knows our struggle, and offers prayers for us, mediates for us to the Father. And so that would be my encouragement, is to look towards the cross, look at the cross, understand why Jesus did what he did, and understand that there is undeserved suffering, but also there's undeserved grace. And there's none of us that deserves grace. We only receive it by that grace, that undeserved, unmerited love that God pours out on us because he wants to and he chooses to. Mm-hmm. And that's a beautiful thing that we can look at even in the midst of our suffering, even though it's hard to do at the moment. Remember God's goodness, just like Job does, to ultimately say, but my Redeemer lives, and he will vindicate me.
Mm-hmm. And that our suffering would draw us to the Lord and not run from him. We have a choice in our suffering, and he is the God of all comfort, and he is the one that, he is worth it.
We see that in Job's story, actually, with Job and his wife. Mm-hmm. His wife says, curse God and die. And you don't see her again. Mm-hmm. Job says, no. No, from dust I came and to dust I will return. Like that's how Job understands it. And so then he worships.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we thank you guys so much for watching, and we look forward to doing this one again with you next week.